Oh, righty. All righty. So just wanted everyone to know that as well. And then we're getting ready to get started. I'll give it about 1 more minute just for a few more people to actually jump on and see who's going to make it. And then we'll go ahead and get started. How's everyone doing today? All right.
Good, but I want to be outside.
Me too, me too. I got to have breakfast with Karen Rowe, who I absolutely adore. If you know Karen, Nikki, if you don't know Karen, she's just amazing in our community. And she leads our House of Hope, which she does transitional housing for women and families. And so I love having breakfast and coffee with Karen. But even after having that with Karen, I still wanted to be outside. That's how beautiful the weather is. So, and she's one of my favorite people, but still, it was a pool. So, all righty, we'll begin in about 1 more minute to see if more people are going to join us. All right, well, we'll go ahead and get started. So again, I am beyond excited to have Nikki Foster today from the Northwest Area Foundation. Nikki is a program officer that identifies prospective grantees and advocates for their communities. Her job involves a strong human connection, getting to know her grantee organizations on a meaningful level, amplifying their stories, and working together to advance change. At a young age, Nikki knew she wanted to work with organizations committed to lifting up communities and left out of the system. Her great-great-great-grandfather was a part of an underground railroad in Illinois. His story inspired her personal commitment to advancing equity and advocating for racial justice. Sorry about that, Siri's on here talking. She began her career in the nonprofit sector. Make sure she doesn't talk anymore. She began her career in the nonprofit sector, which laid the foundation for her later work focused on serving low-income and underserved communities in the banking services industry. While managing grants for Sunrise Banks, a community development financial institution, she gained valuable insights into programs and policies aimed at helping communities thrive on their own terms. She also worked at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, the Minnesota Housing Partnership, and NeighborWorks America. And so as you can see, Nikki has a breadth of knowledge and information this morning. And so without further ado, let's just dive into some really good conversation, Nikki. And is there anything else you'd like to share after I read that very impressive bio?
No, I would just say, I'm glad you skipped over the part that says I'm an avid Monkees fan, the band, the Monkees, and but also a lifelong resident of Brooklyn Park, which is just outside of Minneapolis, where I've raised, my husband and I have raised our 2 kids. And so that's the only thing I would add is just my role as a mom, because that's a big part of me. So
yeah, nice. I love that. All right, Nikki. And so we talked a little bit about kind of how we wanted the session to go and just why I thought it was so important that you connected with our community. When you reached out to us when I was at a prior organization, you were just very clear on that you wanted to support our work, right? And you made the process very easy, but also from a way of partnership. And so I want to ask, how have you seen the role of philanthropy advance during your time in the industry?
it's a really great question, especially in this month of May, when I am actually celebrating 10 years of service at Northwest Area Foundation. I've now been there for 10 years. And so as I was thinking about this, I thought there's been kind of change at three levels that I would speak to. The first being my own personal change over that 10 years. And I remember I had just left the banking industry. I was on one of my first site visits with a Native-led organization in Rapid City. And I sat down and I had an agenda and we jumped right in. And it was like, question. And one of my colleagues was with me in the room, and we got into the rental car, and he just very wisely said, slow down, slow down. You should have asked about her family, like make that connection, right? And that kind of set the stage for the growth that I hope to personally embody in that 10 years, just in terms of really taking that time, building the human connection. And that's something that personally has always been important to me. And so it's really leaning into that and remembering that in this work. I feel, compelled to be a part of this social change movement and philanthropy and with nonprofits for very personal reasons. And I have to always, remember that. And yesterday I sat in on a webinar, and one of the speakers commented about, if people in philanthropy and systems change aren't in it, for righteous reasons, right? Like then it's not the right lens to think about this work. And so I just know personally over that 10 years, just really learning a lot about myself and how I show up in relationship to others. Northwest Area Foundation, in terms of how it's shifted over the last 10 years, has really been one of deepening our commitment to racial equity, racial justice. We've done some work around what we call JEDI, so justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And that shows up in our grant making in different ways. So when I started at Northwest Area Foundation, we had 4 portfolios of work that we funded. So we really had 2 outcomes that we were driving toward around financial capability and good jobs. And we had these 4 portfolio areas that were very economic development focused. So it was access to capital, financial inclusion, enterprise development, and workforce, work opportunity. And those were very important areas of work. And we had partners in those that were doing that work and just really making great strides and having huge impact. But we have a long held commitment to Indian country and other communities of color. And we were just hearing as we were doing that work that it was limiting, that it wasn't everything. It wasn't embodying the change they were seeking. Like even definitions of wealth and poverty and sustainability and prosperity are different across communities. And so could we think bigger and broader about the use of our resources in a different way? And so we shifted to, it also felt very prescriptive. It felt very much like, as much as we did some listening and learning from our grant partners, it felt like we were coming in and saying, these are the solutions, right? And this is what's going to work, and this is what's important to the change. And that didn't feel comfortable for any of us. It just, because we had learned through our own personal journeys and through our work, that the solutions are in community. And especially in Native communities, we're talking, generations plus of self-determination, of knowing how to care for each other and for community. And so to come in and kind of have this answer, like, this is what we'll fund, right, just didn't sit. And so we undertook a lot of time during the pandemic, actually, to refine our strategy. And today we are looking at organizations that are reimagining and restructuring systems in ways that advance justice, racial, economic, social justice. And it's honoring those worldviews and perspectives that have existed for lifetimes and lifting those up and supporting that work. And so it's a shift away from only thinking about the economics. And we're in the process of changing our mission statement, but it currently has the word poverty in it. So I think that's why we've had an economic focus. But that's from a Western, sort of white perspective, what poverty means. And so we're trying to be much broader with that. And so I think it's meeting the moment and recognizing that things have changed, and there's an urgency to this work, and so sort of supporting justice organizations is really important. And I can answer questions about that approach too, if anyone has any, and dive a little bit deeper into our grant making. But I would say in the industry, how it's kind of mirroring some of our work is I've definitely seen a willingness among philanthropic organizations to collaborate more. I think that's something that funders have often supported is, and sometimes maybe even prescribed, like work together, nonprofits, and do this work. And but we're not reflecting that, right? And that was one of the things that surprised me about philanthropy when I joined Northwest Area Foundation back in 2013. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done there. But then I think there's also some foundations, ours included, that are really taking a critical look at the history of philanthropy, at looking at the history of our own endowment, right? That the wealth of Northwest Area Foundation's endowment comes from the railroad development that went from St. Paul to Washington and Oregon. And so talking about how extractive that development was and damaging to many communities across our region, and how can we think about the work that we do in terms of healing everybody from that, the impacts of that. And so I think there are some foundations that are really examining that and being reflective of that, kind of learning from the past while planning, and visioning the future. And I think there are a subset of foundations that are thinking about evaluation differently also, and some of the paradoxes that we hold, meaning, what is the evaluation truly for the community, and what is it philanthropic gaze? What is it really achieving? And so we're a part of a cohort of foundations looking at equitable evaluation in ways that really center communities of color and Indigenous communities and others that we are working with. So those are a few thoughts on the shifts I've seen over the last 10 years.
Okay, so that is fascinating. So a cohort of nonprofits, which I've heard of some here in Iowa as well too, but that are really looking at kind of revamping what we look at as evaluations, which I know too, you can get very caught in the check the box type of mentality. And like, I have a background, I'm in nonprofits, but worked in education for a little while as well. And so education, we can even get very prescriptive, like, okay, so if it meets this, this, and this, it's good, right? If you do this, then this is the career path. And if you do that and not. And so sometimes when you say, well, wait a minute, we need to be more holistic from this approach, people are more committed to like the outcome than the journey. And so have you seen that as you're doing this? And if you've seen that, could you share an example of when it showed up for you and what's something you may have did to kind of counter that, or to kind of push people a little bit past their comfort zone on, it might not check all the boxes, but this is why this work is still important?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think, and part of the reworking of our strategy that we did was really acknowledging the importance of context. And when you serve an 8-state region that is, Iowa, Idaho, Montana, North and South Dakota, I mean, just the context is so different in different places and with different communities. And so we have shied away from having like standardized metrics that organizations have to report as part of the recognition that that change is going to be different, and really push back on the habit of some foundations to look at scale, right? And like really talking about, what does scale mean? It could be, is it deep? Is it with one person? You make a deep change, that's just as much scale as, XYZ number of clients served. And so I think that's something that the storytelling that is so rich in Native communities and other priority communities that the foundation works with, that those are the things that we're trying to capture. And there can be a tension there, but we have such a supportive board who really wants to hear those stories versus the X plus Y equals Z kind of formulaic way of thinking about impact, and really thinking about the power that there's just a power dynamic with funding organizations like Northwest Area Foundation. And so how can we level that and share the power so that the stories and the impacts are owned by the community and not the foundation? I mean, it just, we're about building strong organizations that are making impacts in their communities, and that's, and taking the foundation out of the picture is just really important, I think, moving forward.
Okay, and that is different, because a lot of times historically in nonprofits, that's just the way it's set up. Even the best of foundation, when you're going to them as a nonprofit person and asking for funding, there can be a power dynamic. And so even thinking about how you share the power, like what are some tips you would give for a nonprofit or a foundation, or if I'm a corporate social responsibility officer that is really invested in being more equitable in our funding practices, what are some tips? Like what would be like the first step? And I know we just said we don't want to be prescriptive, so we don't want to do 1, 2, 3, but then I turn around and ask you 1, 2, 3, but like just to get started, because sometimes I think people want to move in that direction, but the challenge is in thinking about how do I go in that direction? If I have a board that's interested, but they haven't been all bought in yet, or we've done it this way for so long, like what are some things that you would even recommend?
Yeah, I mean, I do think, as a starting point is taking a look at the governance of the organization and the foundation. We are very intentional around geographic diversity on our board, racial diversity on our board, just lived experience, so that and that helps to build empathy on the board and a willingness to hear some of the stories. So that's, I know that's a much different conversation than I didn't even think I would bring that up today. That's kind of something with the that I have found at Northwest Area Foundation to be so helpful, that yearning for the stories and wanting to understand and sort of who is in partnership with staff around making decisions around grant making and what they want to hear as we're deciding on different funding opportunities. I would share one of the initiatives that I have worked on over the last 10 years is poorly named, but it's the African American Financial Capability Initiative. And it was like 2016, 2017. This was under our old strategy. And we funded Black-led organizations to work as communities of practice. And the RFP was around how will you work together to create or refine culturally tailored financial inclusion services and financial education, for example. And we did that work, and it was in part in recognition of the severe underinvestment in Black-led organizations across our region. That so often we were hearing from grant partners that, I'm invited to XYZ table but I'm not compensated, but I'm there to, provide voice for the Black community, for example, or, and just that tension around being recognized and lifted up as an important driver of that change, not just someone to, to tap into and kind of where that power lies. And so this is about shifting it to Black-led organizations to lead this change. And so we started off on that work, and as the communities of practice went out to talk with community members and share this initiative, there was pushback from the community, like, that's not what we need. That's not, we in Seattle, we want to regain this central district neighborhood. We want to, this is where we've had Black businesses in the past and Black homeowners, and we've been pushed out of this community. We want to regain ownership here. And so they worked on a land trust and bought the first Black bank in Seattle, the building where that was. They, bought that building and revitalized that community. And so from a funding standpoint, it was a lot of back and forth around outcomes and budgets and some of those transactional pieces. Right. But it was really the relationships that were being built among organizations, with the foundation, with community members. That was kind of like a big, like when we step back and really don't prescribe that, right? The power and the impact that those communities of practice had. So some of you may have heard of One Economy down in Des Moines. That was an entity that's been part of that initiative. And our experience there really helped inform our strategy now, like really about the power that happens when we get out of the way. When we're truly supporting and building trust. And it's not about just building trust, but maintaining that trust and expressing it in a way that's like, yeah, that's okay. I mean, if that's what the community wants, why would we argue that? We're not from the community, or we're not, and so it's really shifting that. That was that's one example of an initiative that we shifted, and our board was really interested in the story. And we worked with a national intermediary to do some technical assistance with the organizations. And they created what's called the blueprint that kind of shares the lessons, not just for foundations, but also for nonprofit partners that may want to work with some of the entities that were a part of this initiative, for technical assistance providers, right? Like that's really important too. If you're a technical assistance provider, what's important? Yeah, so I think that's one example where we really did some dramatic shifting. And some of the lessons and some of the listening that we did was, it was really important to create that Black space for the entities to come together. And the fact that the foundation wasn't insisting on being a part of it was something that they felt really good about, like that was really critical to not have that gaze. They're the philanthropic gaze. So yeah, I'll stop there. But it's one.
No,
one
that
example.
is good. So Marvin DeGier is a part of One Economy in Des Moines, and he's actually going to be on next month on economic inclusion. And Marvin is, I think you know Marvin. I think he actually was the one that said, you need to reach out to Waterloo.
Yeah.
To you actually. So Marvin is amazing, and he's just done some great work between Evelyn K. Davis, One Economy, and now he's actually the Chief Diversity and Equity Officer for the Greater Des Moines Partnership. So I'm excited to talk to him. But I love what you described, because what you described was kind of responsive philanthropy, right? Where you actually built in a space, and sometimes this happens unknowingly, right? Where you actually could respond to what the community actually needed. And that's a challenge though, because a lot of times boards don't understand the need for that, or even, you know, if that's not the way we've normally done it, that's a hard sell for people. And so I love that not only did you all take the outcomes of that, but then you produce something that so that other communities could actually learn from that as well. I think that's really so good. And so you mentioned too that nonprofit leaders of color are still struggling for equitable levels of support. And we had 2020 happen, and there was this booming kind of influx of we want to support. Now in 2023, there's a lot of stats coming out and saying that that's waned, that people made these commitments to equity, inclusion, belonging, that they are now backing off of. In your space, are you seeing that? And if you are seeing that, this question is kind of twofold. How has your organization kind of handled that, seeing that experience of people now shying away from DEI practices? And then also, what are some things that you say when you get that pushback?
Yeah,
I know that was a long question.
Yeah, so I'll start to answer and reel me back if I'm not answering you properly, like as you hoped. And this is such a timely question. Yesterday, I sat in on a webinar from the Black Collective Foundation of Minnesota, which was established 2 years ago, I think, to really have Black-led philanthropy in Minnesota. And they released a research report around sort of how funders can support racial justice and that sort of thing. The beginning of the conversation was some data that the Philanthropic Initiative for Racial Equity had put together. And I know this is very Minnesota specific, but I think it's probably common across the country. And I was shocked and horrified to find out that in 2020, only 3.3% of funding went to racial equity efforts, and only 0.6% went to racial justice. And I was like, in Minnesota, you know, and as we're coming up on the really sad anniversary of George Floyd's murder, right? Like that in 2020, that shift didn't happen. And there's been so much narrative and headlines around this influx of, you know, funding and criticisms of some of the organizations that received funding during 2020. And I think it's on philanthropy to push back on those narratives and do better. And I mean, it's just that, you know, and really examining that. Northwest Area Foundation for over 10 years has dedicated 40% of new grant funding to Native-led organizations. Kind of given the history of the foundation, it's been an area that we've really been committed to, in part a healing and repair, and also just it's a large part of our region. There's 76 sovereign Native nations. So we've always tracked leadership around Native communities, and then started tracking around all of our priority communities, which are immigrants, refugees, people of color, and people in rural areas, and then Native Americans. And we have found that our grant funding, 80% goes to BIPOC-led organizations. And And so I think it's important that we, again, it's not being prescriptive, but that we really are taking an honest look at our grant making, because then that's where you can see where are some of the biases in the system, right? It's recognizing that philanthropy can be a part of the very system, is a part of the very system that that you're trying to change or restructure. And so tracking that and measuring that. And then we've just created an external report in the last month that shares that. We've looked at that. And it's not just grant making. I mean, foundations have assets in all different ways that they should be tracking. Our expenditures, like who are we hiring for catering? Anything that we're doing. Like I even track my, expense report. Did I go to a priority community owned business, right, for my lunch? And we're tracking that level of detail around racial equity and justice and our investments. So we have a set aside for mission investments, for program related investments. Who are the asset managers that we're working with? Are they dedicated to JEDI and all of that? And so I think in terms of the question around, is it waning? I mean, I think there are some troubling signs that it is, and that foundations were very flexible in 2020, 2021, and are starting to maybe, I can only speak from a Northwest Area Foundation perspective, but our board's asking more of the impact questions again. And as we've kind of exited the pandemic, like, are we kind of going back to those old habits? One of the things that we've done is almost all of our grants are now general operating, and that's a shift for the organization, but also just so key to justice, in my opinion, because that's, relationships are so important to racial justice, in my opinion, and that's really helping organizations be able to be flexible in their own approach, because if we haven't learned anything since 2020 is that nothing stands still, right? Like, I mean, so if we have a grant that starts in 2022, 2026, we have no idea what that's going to bring. So our funding should be flexible, so that the community organization can be flexible to meet the needs. Because if we had all project grants that assumed, that we weren't going to be hit with another variant of COVID or something, and then we're spending all this time just reworking a grant agreement, I don't know, it just stymies the impact and potential for change. So did I answer your question?
You did. No, that was great, because that is a hard one when you think about getting organizations to just lean into supporting operations and things of that nature. Now, I know some of our foundations in town, they are going for that or asking that question, or even, it's funny, like as a nonprofit leader, you get conditioned like, I can't ask for that. And I've had some be like, ask us for that. Like, it's okay, right? And so that's been a good change that we are seeing in our area. But again, when you say that most of your grants are for that, I mean, that is thinking ahead, so that you're not spending time on having to reshape that, but you're actually saying, okay, we want to support you and how you do the work. So really, really appreciate that. Do you have something right now that you all are working on that you feel like, okay, so this thing that we got is such a thing that when people hear about it, they want to be connected to it. And I'm so excited for it, Joy, just as it pertains to your mission and some of your way of thinking.
Okay, I'll try. Like, I am so excited about this new theory of change and the work that we're doing that highlights the condition, what we've identified through listening, I should say, what we're reflecting back to our grant partners as conditions for justice that really incorporate things like healing and cultural wisdom and self-determination and power, getting at systemic causes. I mean, I remember in the African American Financial Capability Initiative, just such a mouthful, we'll just say AAFC, someone saying that the system intentionally excludes people, and so we need to rebuild it in a way that systemically includes people. We need to create this whole new system. And so that focus, I think, is really energizing to me, and is very hopeful, and it helps, and it kind of calls the question, like, join me in imagining a world that's different, that is inclusive of everybody, where everyone's humanity is centered, right? I mean, this is why we're all in this work, is because of humanity. Like, and so I love that we have we have a set of values at Northwest Area Foundation that includes heart, and courage and social justice. And it's recognizing the wholeness of everybody, right? And that's really important. And we're not going to be perfect. And I'm not saying we're meeting that aspiration, but that's what we're driving toward. So I'm really excited about that. I'm really excited about thinking about the assets that are typically invested in Wall Street, how we can use more of those assets to lead systems change and justice, thinking about managers of color that are looking for investments, and how can we support nonprofits with grants? Yes, but is there a loan option that we can provide, or some other way that we can invest in nonprofits to use more of our endowment for mission? And then I also think with our previous strategy, we did invitation funding, and that's really helpful to help like for some of the metrics that I spoke of earlier, like you're really examining an organization in advance of as far as leadership and approach before inviting a proposal. So hopefully it helps minimize time spent by the nonprofit. But we also feel like there are organizations in our region, and really that's how I met you, Joy. It's like, what other organizations should we know about? And so we plan to do more outreach this summer and have more of an open process. There's still a lot of details yet to be hashed out there, but that's something that we're working on right now. And lastly, I would say, because we've done a lot of internal JEDI work around interrogating all of our policies and practices, just from an HR perspective, but also just how our application process is put together and things like that. We have a tool called the Racial Equity Magnifier, or REM. And a Gen Xer, then I can't help but start singing some, Michael Stipe songs, but it's the REM. And we take all of our processes through that, and we uncover like, what worldview do I bring to this decision that we're making? What are some of the racialized narratives and stereotypes or stories that are a part of this? Who's being helped or maybe harmed if we make this decision? And at the end of it, hopefully, it helps us make decisions that fall on that side of racial equity and racial justice. And so we've thought about that in terms of our outreach process. We changed our holiday policy to one where we no longer follow like federal holiday calendars. It's really, we have a set of holidays, and you have, as an employee, have an opportunity to say, this is the day that's important to me, and this is my holiday. And it's just really uncovered a lot of some of the, dominant norms that show up in any organization, and how can we dismantle them and kind of just internally even operate in a way that leads to more justice.
I love that you dived into the HR piece of it, like our own organizations, because a lot of times when you work nonprofit world, you're really not in it for the money. You're in it typically because you're passionate about the mission, you want to be connected, and you want to do good. And so sometimes what that can have is this disconnect from that you still need to do your own work too, right? And you need to make sure your board is doing their work and that your staff is doing your work too. And so sometimes, before everyone joined on, I was sharing with Nikki, and I think a lot of you on here know this, I have a trans daughter, and I was sharing the things that I have to unlearn around that, because I am a person that grew up, I'm 27, we're going to say that, years old right now. And so what comes with those years of things that I unknowingly probably caused trauma to my own child, right? And so I don't want to continue that. Even a person that's in the work of doing DEIB work or JEDI work, I still have to unlearn those norms. I still have to do my own work so that when my child shows up, I'm providing as much of an affirming environment as possible. And I'm not going to get it right all the time. My 13-year-old, she consistently checks me on things, but understanding that we have to do the work. And so I love that you dived into that too, because sometimes I've worked at organizations before where it felt like, well, no, because of our mission, we don't need to be in this facilitation. We don't need to do this type of training. We have our mission, right? And so people understanding that if you really want to fulfill your mission, a part of that means you have to do and unpack the stuff that you're bringing in that work environment.
100%. Yeah. And we had a number of staff that went through, there's a book called Me and White Supremacy, and you go through and read the book and have some exercises. And so we were able to have conversations as staff about that. We've done white supremacy and racial justice trainings with an outside facilitator, done intercultural development inventory work, and it's really important, and especially because I'm really trying to be mindful. I need the 13-year-old check on it every once in a while, but just make sure not showing up in a, sort of the savior way. Like, and I think that's what philanthropy has to really wrestle with, is like, if true partnership is what you're seeking and true relationship, it has to be reciprocal, and and there has to be shifts on both sides. And with our new theory of change and a lot of work that we've done, is that recognition of philanthropy as part of this extractive system. It grows out of racial capitalism and all those things. We've done some work on there's a series of blogs on our website if you're interested in reading them. A couple of other program officers and I went through some work on racial capitalism and thinking about alternatives to that, and how organizations, like many that went through the AAFC initiative, really worked through that, and the calls from our partners to be truth tellers and really think of philanthropy's unique role in society, and how we can maybe say things in settings that may be hard for a nonprofit, or how can we support with our communications as well, and really taking a stand in ways that support the organizations we work with. But I'll stop there.
No, that's really, really good. I so agree with that. And if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. I'm getting down to my last question, but I can talk. So whenever Nikki and I talk, our first conversation, I think we talked for like 2 or 3 hours.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how we got here, because there was just so much going on and on and on. So I definitely don't want to hog Nikki for giving us this afternoon time. So if you have any questions, you can feel free to drop them in the chat or come off mute and ask as well, because she does have a wealth of knowledge. And so, Nikki, some of those things that you share, I would love if you would send some of those, like the report that you all did based off of that study in Washington, because then I'll also share it out with our group as well.
Yeah, I can do that. And I'll send the racial capitalism blogs and the report that was released yesterday about racial justice funding in Minnesota. Yeah, I'll send that, because I think awesome. it had some really good invitations to funders to think about relationship and change at the speed of courage, right? It was which I'm saying speed of change at the speed of trust, I think, and this call to be more courageous, which is something that Northwest Area Foundation has now as a value. So anyways, I will send those most definitely.
So it's good. I love hearing, because Northwest Area, you all are doing a lot of that. And from our experience, have you ever been a part of an organization that wasn't leaning into some of those? And then if they weren't, what were some things that you did to kind of like you said, get some of that change going and build trust around it and things of that nature?
Yeah, I think it almost goes back to the first story I shared about investing time in connecting with people, and I think in some of the settings where where racial equity wasn't centered, it was really about taking time to get to know people and just have conversation and share stories. And I think there's just so much, it's hard. We're all, zoomed out probably from the last 3 years, but sort of even using technology in a different way. Like, I think we found in the last few years being able to do more outreach in states that are further away from our headquarters in St. Paul, right? Because we had this technology and could really see people's faces and all of that. But I think, I can think back to, and even, my time. So I'm a graduate of Luther College down in Decorah. And I was just telling this story. I graduated in '96, and we actually had a small student group, students taking on prejudice, trying to do some education among students around racial, some of the discrimination that was happening, and just having vignettes of examples of microaggressions or things that were happening, and just the power of storytelling. So I think in some of the professional settings I've been in, it's been just trying to understand other perspectives and listen, and which is just such a huge value of mine. You can clearly tell I like to talk too, but it's I want to make sure to hear people and really, and then also reflect on the change that needs to happen. Like, I as a result of that listening. And that's what I appreciate about some of the work we've done at Northwest Area Foundation, is that it's listening and learning for change. It's not listening and learning for listening and learning's sake, right? It's really thinking about what's going to shift as a result of this learning. And that's what we've really pushed. And I can just clearly remember when Philando Castile was killed, just miles from our office. We were in a meeting and someone just kind of stopped us and said, like, we have to recognize our collective grief and hurt from what just happened, and like, just you can't separate out some of these current events and how it's affecting our work. And I think that's the other thing that I think is just we just can't. It's just too hard to ignore that in this work, and in this particular line of work, especially some of these conditions and events that are happening. Yeah, so I think just listening and trying to connect to each other and have healthy dialogue that respects everyone's views and acknowledges everyone's humanity, I would just say.
That you have had quite a few, and all across the country, there have been traumatic experiences. But when I think of Minnesota and Minneapolis, St. Paul area, there's been a lot there. And so how do you take your own organization's mental health into consideration? Because like, I was just at coffee, I mentioned, and Karen's actually on here. We had coffee this morning for a meeting, and somebody asked me, well, how are you doing? And I'm like, everything is really good, but I'm really passionate about the work. And so sometimes when all the songs feel good, sometimes you have to remind yourself, like, okay, now my ankle's hurting. I need to come off the dance floor and take a breath and catch a breath. So how do you, in your lane of being in that area where you were experiencing all that trauma, and then also being in a position where you can essentially kind of assist and you can give voice to power to people and things of that, how do you take care of your own mental health? And from a personal standpoint, and you don't have to go as deep as you're comfortable with, right? And then also from an organizational standpoint too, because like, I'm a nonprofit leader and I want to make sure, as my board president is on here too. Hi, Ms. Deb. And as we are growing our organization, I want to be sure, and my co-chair too, that we think about that. Like, I think about the people that work for us. How am I making sure that as they are dealing with barriers and trauma, I'm also taking care of them as well? And so two-part question, again, as you can see, I love two-part questions, but first on a personal level and then from an organizational standpoint.
Yeah. So, personally, so I was, born and raised in Brooklyn Park and married my high school sweetheart. And now we still, live in Brooklyn Park. And Dante Wright was killed just a few miles from our home. And we have a biracial home. And my son was 20, the same age that Dante was when he was killed. And so it just was one of those moments of my family, of course, was number one. I'm thinking about them and caring for them, listening to them, acknowledging my own privilege and worldview in this conversation, but also like how the parallels with Dante's family and mine were just like so, and it was like right here, right? It was like right in our community. And I often think about how, with my family in particular, with my kids, like how I can share the hope and just real power in leaders like you, Joy, that I am so honored to work with every day. Like that's my job. And it's like, and I just take back like this tremendous amount of gratitude and humility around what I am engaged in, during the day. We all know it doesn't turn off at 5 o'clock, but and because I think that generation, those that are coming behind me and everything need to hear that. Like, I think the noise is so concentrated on some of the negative and our division that I just feel like as much as I can share the stories with my kids of people coming together and really making change, I mean, there's so much that's happened across our region where people are fighting against some really hateful forces and they persevere and they come together. And I think that is part of my own healing, is just thinking, is drawing on the strength of those of you working in community. And so I think a lot about that with my kids, like, what story can can I share with permission that, that really helps others think about what's possible, as opposed to just hearing all the noise, the negative sort of narratives that are out there. So I think that's a little bit, on the personal side, and then and really just grounding myself in this work is so healing to me in so many ways, because I think as we really stay focused on those most impacted by these oppressive systems, that's really, really important, but it's really a source of healing for everybody, right? And so thinking about that. At Northwest Area Foundation, I think, even having healing as part of an important condition for justice, just even acknowledging that was something we were hearing from organizations, especially Native communities. And so talking to organizations about that and acknowledging it, and even acknowledging self-care, which sounds very individualistic, but we mean it in a much more collective sense. Like, it's not about just the individual, but also how are we collectively caring for each other, being something that we fund, right? Like, it's okay if you have a line item in your budget for staff retreats or for staff care, and really following the lead of some organizations out in Washington that created a whole coalition for BIPOC executive directors that includes every other month they do a self-care session, and then the following month they strategize on advocacy and stuff like that. And I just think that's important to recognize, to support, to fund. I mean, to really provide resources for that is really, really important. And because, yeah, it's just expressing that care can be your own care too. So
I love that. Oh, I love that idea. And I know someone on here, we talked about that before, that even here locally, like Miss Deb is she's my chair, but then she also leads Jesse Cosby Center, which has been doing amazing work. They've been around forever, but I will say this, as a person of color in this community, you do have to wear this hat where not only do you lead your own stuff, but then you have to be a supporter for your entire community. So like Joyce Livingston's on here, she's a new executive director of YWCA. If she needs a board member, it will, you know what I mean? That's how you work. And so it does, and hope nobody records this, but it gets heavy, right? It does get heavy sometimes, where you feel like, I don't want to let Miss Deb down. I don't want to let Nilvia down. I don't want to let Joy down. Like, I want to be able to be there for everyone. And so sometimes you can find yourself getting to a point where your cup is empty. Now, as I'm getting older and I'm nearing 30, I'm learning how to take time and, again, come off that dance floor, refill my cup, take a break, enjoy my 13-year-old when she's not giving all the things that 13 gives. Like, I'm learning those things, but there is a heavy responsibility. And so I do appreciate people that invest in that, because that is something else that isn't spoken about in the community, that you do have to wear these multiple hats and carry these multiple burdens, and you're almost, not even almost, you feel privileged to do so, right? Like, you're like, there are so many powerful people that came before you that helped so that you can be in the position that you're in, that you almost feel like, I don't want to show like that I'm weak, or that I don't appreciate the things that they did so that I could be here today. But just getting to a point where, like, but I need to also plan so that I can be here tomorrow. And so maybe I need to go to bed at night. Maybe I need to take a holiday weekend and things like that. So I appreciate that you actually do fund and invest in that. And I know we've had discussions about that before, about how important that is. Our community is starting to look at that as well too. And I just value that so much, because there is some amazing leaders in this community, but you get tagged quite a bit.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And I think even, acknowledging that that heaviness, and like, I live with a disability. And so if I speak up during a conversation internally about a policy or something that I feel is, maybe harmful to people with disabilities, right? Even having someone just acknowledge how hard it was to speak up, right? Like that means a lot. And it's kind of in this connection and making sure that we're recognizing that, and especially not expecting it from people. I have to do my own work. I need to make sure I'm educating myself on issues and not only drawing on great leaders, so that hopefully that expresses that collective care for everybody and everyone's mental health, because we want you here too, right? And energized. And so how can we share that? And stop there.
All right. Well, Nikki, it is 12:51, and
No
I
way.
know I know, right? I hope you all feel the same way, that this conversation just really went very quick. And again, if you have some questions that you didn't have a chance to drop in the chat, but you think of something later on, if you shoot me an email, I will definitely get them over to Nikki, and we're going to connect on some of that other data. But I just want to thank you so much, Nikki. I appreciate it. Here's the thing about Joy, like once you're in my circle of my hymns, I ask a lot. Like I'm always calling like, Megan, can I have some of your time? Chelsea, can you give me 15 minutes or whatever have you? And so I just appreciate the people that, come and share and are like, no, Joy, it's not too much. And they see that, they have similar missions and they're willing to invest in that and give your time, talent, and treasure. So again, I say that to all of you that attended today as well. Just keep joining these sessions with us. And Nikki, I just want to thank you so much for joining us. We talked about, Joy Levinson said, yes, you do ask a lot. I do. I own it though. I own that I ask a lot, right? But we talked about getting you here in person sometime to have some type of retreat. And so I think that would just be absolutely amazing. And I hope that if it happened, we can have some us time, but then we could also invite some other people to the table.
No, I would love that. I mean, and I am traveling again. So just started actually this month traveling again post pandemic stuff. So I would love that, and a chance to meet all of you in person. I will share one of the things the foundation has instituted is a sabbatical policy. And so I will be on sabbatical, talk about self-care. Yes. and so I'll be on sabbatical this summer. But I think, I wish I could gift that to every nonprofit leader that I know, because it's such a gift to have that time.
Yes.
And I just really appreciate everyone showing up today and listening, and would welcome a one-on-one conversation or any questions today too. I have time to hang on if anyone has anything today.
All righty. Well, thank you all. And Nikki, if you feel okay, I can share your email just in case anyone wanted to reach out about anything. Because again, when you talked about the racial equity magnifier, Joy said, thank you for your wealth of knowledge in the chat. And some of the conditions for justice, I would be super interested in the conditions for justice too, because sometimes I think when people hear justice, they automatically go to our legal system, but there are justice as it pertains to economics and housing and things of that nature too. And so how do we have a shared language so that people can understand that? And that sounds like some of the things you're starting to lean into. So I would love some of that information as well. And I just, again, want to thank everyone for attending. Tomorrow, at 1 o'clock, if you all are available, we're launching an app that is called The Hub, Nikki. This is really exciting because we're going to connect service providers in a digital space so that if someone is experiencing food insecurity versus them have to go through a bunch of doors, we're going to bring service providers to people, right? And so, and Ms. Deb, I don't know if you want to share something quickly about The Hub and what we're launching tomorrow. Okay, she said no. She's good. Okay, but we're really, really excited about it. I mean, they've been working on it for a while now. And so we think it's going to really help. The goal is to make sure we have a community that people are ready for career advancement. They're ready for opportunities, but that's something that's hard to do if you are experiencing homelessness, if you're experiencing food insecurity. And so we want to be able to help streamline how people receive service, because we want to do it in a way that's humane, that's affirming, so that people aren't feeling like I'm in crisis mode and you're asking me in crisis mode to walk through 4 different doors just to get out of crisis mode. And so we're going to talk more about that tomorrow at the the launch of the hub. The official launch is in July, but we're sharing information starting tomorrow so that organizations can begin to sign up for it. So really, really excited about that. And yeah, thank you all for joining today. Have a great rest of your day. So
Enjoy the weather. It's really nice to
Thank
meet all of
you.
you.
thank you. Thank you. Nikki, thank you so much too. And after your sabbatical, I won't even bother you before your sabbatical. See, that's new. I used to be so annoying that I would be like, let's schedule you to come here in the fall. Look at Miss Deb say, yes, she does.
No, I'm happy to. I mean, I'm looking forward